Hey everybody, welcome to another multi-game My Thoughts On video, and we're going to continue the Man with No Name trilogy idea, this time with the good, the bad, and the ugly. But of course the problem with that is that that doesn't work all that well as a pun on first-person shooters, so I have to do things a bit differently with this one. I did get a few suggestions on how I should handle working in the FPS theme with the good, the bad, and the ugly, and the one that I'm using as a sort of baseline for the idea of this particular video actually came in from a couple of different viewers who commented on that video, so thank you to those of you who suggested this idea. And that was just a good game, a bad game, and an ugly looking game. But since I don't really put much of a premium on graphics, that's not really all that fitting for what I normally do, so I decided to do things a bit differently with a set of categories. You have good, which are games that I don't have much to say about, but are ultimately pretty solid, and I do ultimately recommend if you're into that kind of thing. And then bad and ugly are going to be things that are a bit different from what I normally do. Now, on my review scale, 1.5 out of 5 is considered a bad game, but in this particular case, I'm going to be going over some games that are just weak. They're not terrible or anything, but they would fall in basically the 2.5 or 2 out of 5 categories if I were to do full reviews of them. And then there's the ugly category, which would be the games that fall into the 1.5 and lower spectrum on my scale. Again, assuming I were to actually do full reviews of them as of what I've played in those games. Now, because I'm doing this in category format rather than just purely in alphabetical order, I'm going to do alphabetical order within the categories. And since I'm going to be doing categories this time around, I decided to do 2 games per category. And again, these are all going to be first-person shooters or first-person action games of some sort. So without further ado, let's go ahead and just start getting right into the good ones. Now, of course, there is going to be a bit of irony with this first choice in the good category, because this isn't really so much a first-person shooter, or really even a first-person action game in a traditional sense. This is Cyberhook, developed by Blazing Stick and published by Graffiti Games in September of last year, and this is really more of a first-person platformer than anything else. But it does have the ability to shoot blocks in it, which means that it sort of gets off on a technicality there. Thing is, you still could count this as an action game in the sense that it is still a very fast-paced game where you are trying to get the shortest times possible. You see, this is really a game all about speedrunning. You have a pretty limited set of abilities. You can, of course, run around, you can jump, you can do an air jump, you can lash out with your cyber hook and attach to something, and then use that as a sort of grappling hook to swing yourself around, and you can also use a shooting mechanic to shoot green blocks that are impeding your progress, as well as use a time warp mechanic to slow down time to give yourself a bit of extra distance, as well as potentially correct a mistake. Based on how quickly you complete a level, you get a certain number of crystals, and as you continue to collect crystals, you will gain access to more content in the game. It is ultimately a very straightforward game, and it is designed around speedrunning, so you are trying to get the fastest times possible, and as you might expect for a game that's really built around speedrunning, the game does include leaderboards both for your own region as well as worldwide. And not only can you go into those leaderboards and look at the times that the top players have gotten, you can also look at the runs that they have made by downloading and viewing the replays of those particular runs, so you can see what they did and maybe learn from that. And for what it is, Cyberhook is a very well put together game. It's fast paced, the controls are buttery smooth, it's got all the features you would hope for in a game that's built around speedrunning like that. It's very easy to pick up, but obviously difficult to master, and on top of all of this, it even has a very nice bright and colorful retro-inspired aesthetic that is very visually pleasing. And thus I can wholeheartedly recommend it to people who are into this particular kind of game. Thing is, I'm not one of those people. While I do certainly like watching speedruns on occasion, and I find speedrunning interesting, it's not something I actually like participating in, so a game like this doesn't really do a whole lot for me, even though it is very well made. In fact, the only reason I'm taking a look at the game at all is because I got a copy of it in a Humble Bundle, so I figured I'd go ahead and give it a try. If you're curious about the game yourself and aren't sure if you want to spend money on it, then there is actually a demo available, and that is available through Steam, so you might as well go ahead and give that a try if you're still on the fence. But if this looks like something you would be interested in, chances are you're probably going to find a fair bit to like here. The second of the games in the good category is Shrine. This is a first-person shooter by Scumhead that runs in the Doom engine, specifically GZ Doom. And the idea here is that you play as a guy named Tusk, who is a skinless eldritch monstrosity, and he is trying to fight a horde of other eldritch monstrosities. Obviously, one of the things you're going to notice immediately about the game is its art style, which is still pixel art in keeping with the Doom engine, of course, but it has a very muted color palette to where certain colors are used to emphasize certain things. For example, with the pickups, blue is health, green is armor, and red is ammunition. But it goes beyond simply the pickups there, of course. There are also certain things in the environments that are going to have certain colors emphasized, and thus they'll really stand out compared to other things. And on top of all of that, of course, everything has that strange, Lovecraftian-inspired eldritch monstrosity vibe going on, and that really does set the game apart quite a lot. The thing is, once you get past that, this is still more or less just a total conversion mod of Doom. The gameplay itself is very straightforward. You go from area to area, you blast basically everything in your path, and you have a variety of weapons, each occupying certain archetypes to use against your foes. For example, you'll start out by picking up the pistol equivalent, and then you'll get a shotgun equivalent, chainsaw equivalent, double-barreled shotgun equivalent, so on and so forth, all of which have suitably strange eldritch designs to them to make them stand apart, even though functionally they're more or less identical to their Doom counterparts, but with the addition of secondary fire functions on some of the weapons. Similarly, most of the enemies are just modeled after the archetypes that were present in the original Doom and Doom 2, but there are a few that take a bit of a different approach, and there are certainly some tweaks in there to make certain enemies a bit more challenging or a bit weaker, depending on what they are. Aside from those, the level design itself is actually pretty simple for the most part. It's very straightforward, everything is very clearly signposted, and this isn't an especially long or even particularly difficult game. In fact, at times it almost feels a bit too easy. But all things considered, for a total conversion of Doom, this is actually pretty solid for the most part. It's got some very striking artwork, and there are certainly things that could have been improved, but the second Shrine took a wildly different direction, which is why I will be covering it some other time. But as for the original Shrine, if you were looking for a pretty solid total conversion of Doom, this is definitely a solid option for you, and I will certainly have a link in the video description box to where you can take a look at it. And now that I've covered all of the games that I want to do in this particular video for the good category, let's go ahead and move on to the bad category. And the first of the games in the bad category is Generation Zero. This is a first-person shooter by Systemic Reaction that runs on the Avalanche engine, which is the same engine that powers the Just Cause games, if you're not familiar with it. And it bills itself as a sort of open-world survival co-op shooter, but you can play it in single-player, and it does have something vaguely resembling a story, so I decided to mess around with it in single player and see exactly what it's all about. And the first thing I found out is that the FOV slider only goes from 50 to 80 degrees, which is a really bizarre field of view range, and based on what I have seen from the Steam discussions and such, the only thing I can really figure is that maybe it's showing this in vertical field of view numbers rather than horizontal. Developers, I implore you, if you are going to put a field of view slider in your game, which you should put some form of FOV adjustment in any first-person game, period, then don't use vertical FOV, because nobody understands it. The standard is horizontal FOV for a reason. That's what people understand. So if you're going to go vertical, you're ultimately just going to annoy your player base because they're going to have to go find an FOV calculator, calculate the horizontal to the vertical, and then adjust it in the game. Anyway, rambling about the FOV slider aside, once you actually get into the game proper, you find that you are not actually dealing with an open-world survival first-person shooter, because you don't need to worry about food or water or anything of that nature. You can just run around to your heart's content and shoot the living crap out of anything as long as you have ammo for it. Really, the only survival element I can find in the game is just having to scavenge things to craft stuff out of, and that's in pretty much any action game these days, at least in the AAA space, so that's not exactly making this a survival game. Instead, what we actually have here is an open-world first-person shooter where you wander around the mostly empty landscape and find various buildings that might have some useful items in them, and all the while you are trying to avoid or massacre any robots that get in your way. Along the way, you're trying to solve the mystery of why there's nobody around except for these robots, and everything looks like it's been completely abandoned at a moment's notice. And much like Fallout 76 was on launch, you will not be finding any non-hostile NPCs scattered around the area. The only things you're ever going to run into are the robots, which you can either avoid by using the very bare-bones stealth system, or you can just shoot the living crap out of them if you have the ammo for it, and hope you're aiming for those weak points because otherwise you're dealing with massive bullet sponges. Now obviously as you get further into the game you're going to find better weapons as well as more and more ammunition for those weapons, so that becomes less of a problem the further you get in. But starting out, you've got a rusted as hell Müller PP, which is just a janky, gigantic Walther PPK, and that will introduce you to the game's rarity system, because of course it has a rarity system. We have to have that in pretty much any game these days. And so you'll run into plenty of instances where you'll find a weapon that is of the green or blue tier or higher, and you'll continue to wander around and find other weapons that you might actually find considerably more interesting. But of course, because they are not of the correct rarity tier, they are weaker than the stuff you already have, so you might as well just get rid of them. So I guess what we're dealing with here isn't so much a survival first-person shooter, but more of a looter shooter? But then again, there's not really all that much loot. Most of what you're finding is stuff that you can break down into crafting materials, or just ammunition or healing items. That's not really much of a looter shooter. So we're ultimately left with a game where I'm not entirely sure what it wants to be, but the core gameplay loop is extremely boring. You're just wandering from place to place with not much in between them, and then you loot the area for ammunition and other supplies, and you might have to fight off a few robots here and there, but for the most part it's a whole lot of nothing significant, and even the story is basically just, sorry, the princess is in another castle, you need to go there in order to get more information. And I'm sorry, but when faced with the prospect of 20 plus hours of that, I don't think it's worth even bothering with. You see, this game was designed mainly for co-op play, and that shows, because that's about the only way you could possibly have fun with this. And before you give me that crap about, but DW, the game is fun in co-op, you can say that about literally any game that has co-op in it. If you're playing it with your friends, you can have fun. That's how it always has been and always will be, no matter how bad the game actually is. Generation Zero, on the other hand, loses all semblance of luster extremely quickly, and you're left with something that is just plain boring. Which is a shame, because the premise of a mystery first-person shooter where you show up in a place and pretty much everybody is missing and you're trying to work out that mystery all the while trying to scavenge whatever you can is not a terrible idea. It's just the execution here is completely lacking. So I cannot remotely recommend Generation Zero, even if you are going to try to play it in co-op. There's way better games out there, go play one of those instead. The second game I'm going to be taking a look at here in the bad section is We Happy Few, a sort of stealth, action, and survival mix-up that was developed by Compulsion Games and published by Gearbox, and in the interest of full disclosure, I was provided a review copy of this by the game's PR folks. Of course, that was back during the early access period, and back when I played that and did a video on it, it was just an absolute mess. So now the full game is out, it's had a fair bit of patching, it's had the DLCs out. What's it like? Well, it's more or less the same game that I played back in the early access period, but considerably less buggy, although it is still fairly buggy, and it also runs a bit better, for the most part. There's still a lot of really significant frame rate drops, and I can't figure out what exactly causes them. I mean, there's plenty of times when there's tons of stuff on screen being rendered, and yet the game runs perfectly fine, but then I go into a small, cramped area, and then all of a sudden the frame rate tanks down to below 30 FPS for some utterly baffling reason. I have absolutely no idea what's going on there, but it is very annoying. Aside from performance issues and glitches, the rest of the game has certainly been refined compared to what I originally played. You still have that very simplistic quick crafting system where you use a bunch of random junk items to craft useful things like medicines or throwables or upgrading weapons or things like that. And you still have a very basic stealth system coupled with a very basic combat system, neither of which are particularly satisfying. The melee combat in particular is just extremely simplistic. You have a block button, you have an attack button, and you have a shove button. The shove, of course, being used to break blocks and, of course, to get people away from you if they're trying to close in on you. Melee weapons all have a durability rating, and as you continue to use them, the durability will decrease until eventually the weapon breaks. And, of course, like you would think in a game like this, the weapon durability is absolutely pathetic. With the exception of the Jolly Brawly and Not So Jolly Brawly, which are two umbrellas that you can get access to if you pre-order the game, and because I had a pre-release review copy, that apparently counts as pre-ordering the game. Which, of course, in turn basically renders the entire weapon crafting system completely pointless. Because sure, those umbrellas don't do very much damage, but they don't need to because the enemy AI is so incredibly stupid that they are absolutely pathetic to fight. Not to mention the combat is literally just going to be light attack, block, and shove until eventually you get enough skill points to unlock the power attack, and even at that point, you're still not really getting much of anything out of the combat. You're given the option of choosing between lethal and non-lethal weapons, but there doesn't really seem to be any functional difference between them. It just seems that the less lethal weapons do less damage than the lethal ones, and there doesn't seem to be any consequences for using lethal weapons. So with the combat basically being a bust, you're going to probably try to do stealth more often than not, and the stealth in this game is extremely basic. It's crouch and you're in stealth mode. If you're out of the enemy's line of sight, they can't see you. There are a few environmental features that you can hide with, for example, the tall yellow flowering plants, as well as being able to hide under beds or hide in trash cans or things like that. But your only other recourse for stealth is just going to be using things like glass bottles to chuck somewhere and distract enemies, and that may or may not work because, again, the enemy AI is a bit wonky. This all combines with the semi-procedural level design, where certain major features that are relevant to the story are not randomly generated, but the environments between them are, so you'll be wandering around a bunch of prefabs and trying to find whatever useful materials you can, and then you'll go and complete your missions in the actually crafted areas. And the crafted areas are considerably more interesting than the prefab ones, as you might expect. And then on top of all of this, you have these basic survival elements where you need to keep track of hunger, thirst, and fatigue. And if you don't keep track of those and make sure you are topped up on all of them, then you will start suffering debuffs. Thankfully, the game is not particularly stingy with the food and water, so you don't really need to worry about that too much. But the way you have to recover fatigue is by finding a bed to rest in. Now, you don't need to rest that long, but finding a bed you can rest in requires you to wander around for a bit, so that can be mildly annoying if you have to top up your fatigue. But when you bring all of those elements together, you end up with a game that is very heavily rooted in that one time where we were having the big survival game craze and everybody had to throw whatever survival elements they could into whatever game they could, no matter whether it actually made sense or not. And not only does that make the game oddly dated, even though it's only been out a couple of years now, but it also makes it a very, very dull game. Which is a real shame, because the actual setting and the story are actually pretty interesting. It's got a very British sense of humor. It's got the retro future aesthetics going on. It's got the whole dystopian nightmare thing going on, in this particular case, Brave New World, rather than what we normally see, which is Orwellian. And the story is split into 3 characters, so you have 3 different perspectives on what's going on, and you get to reveal more of the mystery of why things are the way they are in Wellington Wells, and what can be done to either fix it or at least escape from it. And if this were, say, a movie or a TV show or something along those lines, that would actually be perfectly fine. But this is still a video game, and when the gameplay is as boring as it is in We Happy Few, that makes it far more difficult to actually experience the story in a way where you can really absorb it. Because you're not going to be wanting to spend the time to wander around and explore, as well as find all of the memories and the letters and journals and such that detail the past and, of course, all the crazy things that are going on in Wellington Wells. Because the simple fact of the matter is, it doesn't really matter how good the writing is in a game if the gameplay is boring enough to make you just not want to play it. So unless you know you can put up with the boring gameplay of We Happy Few, I really cannot recommend it at all. That brings us to the end of the bad section of this particular video, and now we move on to the truly awful stuff, the ugly section. And the first of these games in the ugly category is Alpha Prime, a first-person shooter developed by Black Element and published by Bohemia Interactive in 2007. And this particular section of the video is coming to you courtesy of Flyscar, who sent me a copy of this to take a look at, so thank you for that, it is greatly appreciated. And as far as Alpha Prime goes, where do I even start here? This is just an awful game on every single front, from the absolutely atrocious writing to the god-awful voice acting, which is at times at least sort of amusing because it's so bad, but most of the time it just gives you a headache.
Sì, lucky guy. È fortunato quello. This figone, always with him. An amazing lady, this Livia. Bella donna, very beautiful. What happened to her?
And then, of course, there is the constant interruption of gameplay to throw you into cutscenes, or to throw you into conversation sequences where you're talking to somebody over comms, and these sorts of things last longer than the actual gameplay segments that preceded them a lot of the times. And then, even when the game isn't just shoving cutscenes and conversations in your face, and it's just letting you play it, you're stuck with awful level design that is mostly just boxes or corridors, and often corridors connecting boxes, and there's barely any cover of any kind, but you are given a lean mechanic that is extremely abusable, and a bullet time mechanic that is more or less useless because all of the enemies are hit scanners and just immediately start shooting you once they see you. There's barely any feedback when you take damage, so you don't really know exactly how much damage you're actually taking, other than just simply staring at your health bar. And when you're trying to dish out damage to your enemies, there's just so much smoke and so many particle effects popping up all at once that you can't even really tell what's going on half the time. And it certainly doesn't help that the game is fairly buggy, especially in the physics system, which tends to glitch out a fair bit. And while some people are willing to excuse a lot of the game's issues because they just think that Slav jank is wonderful, in this particular case, it goes past being endearing Slav jank and just ends up being a frustrating mess that is just not fun at all. Well, at least if you're trying to actually play the thing. If you're watching people mock it and make fun of it, on the other hand, then it can be an absolute blast. And in that particular case, I highly recommend you watch Civi's video on it, because it is very amusing. As for the game itself, though, spend your money elsewhere and just avoid Alpha Prime entirely. And last for this particular video, and certainly least, is Legendary, a first-person shooter developed by Spark Unlimited and published by Gamecock Media Group. And this particular video is coming to you courtesy of Lord Chaos, who sent me a copy of this to take a look at years ago, but I could never actually get it working until now. In fact, the last time I tried messing around with this game, it was just blue screening my computer whenever I tried to run it. Now it doesn't blue screen the computer, and it actually does function. But while you might be thinking to yourself, oh, that's a good thing. No, it's not, because now I actually had to play the game. And what I found was a very typical console port, in the sense that it is an awful PC port. There's a weird disconnect between the mouse sensitivity and mouse acceleration when you are aiming down the sights versus when you're shooting from the hip, so I actually found that shooting from the hip was considerably easier to do than trying to aim, which is just baffling. They designed the game so that you would select your weapons using the D-pad, meaning that you only have 4 weapon slots. 2 of these are for your main guns, one of them is for an axe that you'll always have once you collect it, and the other one is for throwables. You can only carry 2 guns at a time, and whenever you want to swap one out, you have to drop whatever your previous one was in order to pick up the new one, which is not going to be that big of a deal because weapons across the game are pretty much a straight upgrade as you continue. Continuing the crappy PC port trend, you can't even rebind your keys. Sure, there's an option for it in the menu, but every single time you try to rebind your keys to something that actually makes sense compared to what you normally play with, it just says, no, you can't do that, because this is already reserved for a different function. I lost count of the number of times I pulled up the PDA interface instead of crouching, because my crouch key is always Control, not C. Now apparently you're supposed to be able to go into the game's config file and change up the key bindings in there, but there's so many bindings reiterated over and over again that I couldn't figure out which ones actually worked, so I changed them all, and it didn't make any difference anyway. I mean, don't get me wrong, Alpha Prime is an awful game, but at least the rebinding keys option in the game actually works. This one is just downright pathetic, and then you start to mess around with the game further, and you find very quickly that the idea itself is actually pretty cool. You play as a thief who is contracted to steal Pandora's box, and upon doing so, you accidentally end up unleashing hordes of monsters upon the world, and from there you have to fight your way through hordes of monsters in order to try to find a way to seal Pandora's box again and keep the monsters from destroying the entire world. And all the while, you're also battling the forces of the Black Order, which is a shadowy organization that hired you to open the box in the first place, and now that you have opened it, they see you as some sort of threat that needs to be eliminated. It's actually a pretty cool pulp action vibe, but unfortunately that is ruined by the game itself, because not only is this just a bad PC port in general, it's just a bad first-person shooter. The enemies are either really weak or really damage spongy, and there's not much in between, so you're either just having to hose down enemies with tons of bullets, which you might think would be an issue, except for the fact that the game gives you effectively infinite ammo, so it makes you wonder why they even bothered with reloads and a maximum ammo amount anyway. Or you're barely even bothered by the enemies and you can take them out in only a couple of shots. They do try to throw in some interesting ideas with the combat, like the werewolves, for example, only being finished off if you decapitate them, but since their head is a pretty easy target, you just put your crosshair right in that general direction and hose them down with bullets, and their head eventually pops off. There's no regenerating health in this game, which is a bit surprising for 2008, but you are given the ability to absorb animus energy from defeated enemies, and that will either just absorb into your animus energy pool, or if you've got maxed out energy, then it will go directly into healing yourself. You can also just hold down the button that you use to absorb animus energy, and it will slowly heal you up anyway, but it depletes your animus energy while you do that, so more often than not, you're just going to wait until something's dead and then absorb the energy from that so you can heal up anyway. There ends up being basically no challenge whatsoever to the combat, and the only thing that's ever going to really bother you about it is just how tedious it is to take down most of the enemies, and how annoying it is when they do hit you because it throws up big red claw marks on the screen that obscure your vision and jerks the camera around. It also certainly doesn't help that this game is just ugly as sin. It runs on Unreal Engine 3, so the visual quality is not atrocious in most instances, but you are dealing with some pretty low-res textures, you're dealing with some modeling that's just okay at absolute best, you're dealing with ugly, grainy, pre-rendered cutscenes, you're dealing with characters that look very fake and plasticky at absolute best, and you're also dealing with environments that are almost exclusively gray. because this was right around the time where they started to really go heavy into the brown and gray route, except this game is not realistic, and it's not even really brown, it's almost exclusively gray, so I can't do my usual channel bit on that. The visual effects don't look very good, the weapons themselves don't really have much satisfying effect on target, and the cutscenes are entirely unskippable, so you are forced to sit through them every single time. All of the other hallmarks of a generic mid to late 2000s console first-person shooter are present and accounted for. You basically can't jump, even though there is actually a jump button in the game. It just is more of a hop at absolute most, and the only way you can get any real distance there is if you sprint first, and of course you have a stamina meter that takes a long time to replenish and drains rather quickly, which is particularly useful in a game where every single environment is extremely cramped, even the ones that are supposed to be air quotes open. This is an extremely linear first-person shooter. In most environments, it's practically a corridor. And on top of all of this, it's a rather unstable game, so your mileage is going to vary wildly depending on your own individual systems, and you might end up going from a system that works perfectly fine with the game, like what I've got currently, or like what happened previously, where it would just blue screen the computer. And of course there's everything in between. There's physics glitches, there's all kinds of weird animation glitches and AI glitches, and there's even game-breaking glitches like falling through the floor in the end of the game and not being able to get to the final boss. And while that core concept of the game is not necessarily bad, the execution is so thoroughly miserable that there is absolutely no reason anyone in their right mind should ever play this. Hell, even the console versions are garbage, and when the console versions of a console-oriented shooter are terrible, then you know you have a serious problem on your hands. But you know what? You can't really be surprised by it, because Spark Unlimited developed it, and they also developed Turning Point Fall of Liberty, which is actually even worse than this game is. And they also developed Call of Duty Finest Hour, which is probably the best game that they have made, and that still got a 1.5 out of 5 on my scale when I reviewed it. And they went on to make 2 games after this, which were Lost Planet 3 and Yaiba Ninja Gaiden Z. And while I haven't gotten around to trying out either of those games yet, I can't exactly say I'm looking forward to it at this point. So there you have it, folks. 6 first-person action games, or first-person shooters, or in one case, first-person platformer kind of thing. All of which I didn't really have all that much to say about individually, so I bundled them all into this particular video and made it the good, the bad, and the ugly. And now that I've gotten to the end of the Man with No Name trilogy as far as theming these particular MTOs go, I'm finally free to explore other ways of making puns out of my video titles for these particular MTOs, so we'll see where that goes in the future. In the meantime, thank you all very much for watching. If you like the kind of videos I make, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that's perfectly fine, I understand. But the option is there if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you all in later videos.